What's up everybody? Welcome back to Elderwood Games. Thomas here. This week I want to talk to you guys about my league document. So this is something that I've actually been working on for a few months now. I had some friends that were thinking about getting into 40K and I'd started devising a kind of league setup with some achievable benchmarks for people getting into the hobby. And I've just kind of slowly been tinkering at some of the bits and bobbles of it over the last few weeks. Just to kind of maybe get an idea of what could be feasible maybe for you all if you're either looking to get into the hobby or maybe start a new project in a new army that would go through. So the basic premise of the league is to get players on a kind of routine schedule with achievable benchmarks along the way to get up to 1,000 points. And I realize that most 40K is at the 2,000 point mark, but I chose to do up to 1,000 because really when you get to 1,000 points, you're able to play, pickup games at local shops, and basically you just have a force that is legal, and there's no real reason to collect after that, because honestly, what you may end up is if you get a group together, you might end up having a few players that just don't really want to collect past 1,000 points, and they're fine with just their little force. And we don't really want to limit them from continuing to be a part of the hobby in any way. So that way they can keep being a part, hanging out with you all, while maybe the rest of you expand your collections up to 2,000 points and likely even further. The idea here is that we're splitting everything into phases. Each phase is up to 250 points. The reason for that is that 250 points is around $200. Probably less in a lot of cases, especially if you go the combat patrol route, but not every one of your players will go that route, and they may want to collect in a different direction. So if we think about this in terms of financial budgeting and that sort of thing, not everyone is going to have that amount of coin for every month. So when we're looking at the length of these phases, think about that in terms of what your players can do, and also think about, you want to be able to get a game or two in on top of your hobby time, on top of building, on top of painting, playing games, and that sort of thing. So this sort of has the idea that each phase is going to be more like 2 to 4 months instead of just being 1 month. And obviously, players can exceed, they can go above that, but each phase will be kind of tailored for 250 points, 500 points, 750, 1,000, and then phase 5 is 1,000 plus, which will kind of talk about some interesting things that you can do after you reach that 1,000 point threshold, because at the end of phase 4 and beginning of phase 5, everyone should have 1,000 point force that they can tweak and add to and that sort of thing. Next up, let's get into the intricacies of the league, how you score points within the league, and maybe some incentives that will keep your players interested. I am going to be referencing it here on my phone, but I am going to have a link to the document in the description below. That way you guys can all have access to it to be able to share, tweak, edit, and that sort of thing. And if you have any edits offhand, please let me know down in the comments below. So starting off, you will earn things I donated as league points. League points can be gained based on how you are performing in your games against your fellow league mates, as well as your hobby progress. At the end of each phase, you'll tally up the 2 best scores from games. So you'll take your victory points for your 2 highest scored games, and then those totals against all the other players in your league will give you a ranking. First place will score 4 league points, second will score 3, third will score 2, and then all other placements will score a single point. Keep in mind, we are building very slowly, and 250, 500, 750 are not supported levels within 40K, and it's very possible that you may have a force that isn't very good at first, or you might have a force that is very good at first. You might have a rough first phase, but it may come back in the second or third phase when you have a more resilient force against some of your other opponents. And that's basically just an idea to be able to play. It'll encourage games, and then it'll give some incentive to the player that ends up being, the highest scoring among you. However, that's not the only way to score points. For example, if you are new to the game and maybe not able to score a lot of points in hopes of achieving that first place in league points at first, you can accumulate more points by building and painting your forces. So basically, infantry, for building it is 1 point, and for painting it is another point. So for every infantry and battle line unit that you build and paint, that is 2 points. For each character or epic hero, monster, vehicle, walker, fortification, basically a lot of the stuff in between is going to be 2 points for building and then 2 points for painting. So that's a total of 4 points for a built and assembled character, epic hero, walker, vehicle, etc. And then lastly is Titanic, and Titanic assembled is 3 points and Titanic painted is 3 points. So for every knight that you build and paint is 6 points. It kind of gives you an idea of how you can build points in other ways. And also if you're just someone that wants to build and play, you don't really want to paint, then you will still be incentivized to build more because obviously what your teammates will be doing with painting, you can use that time to build, or you can use that time to play and be able to maybe build up a higher average of points to be able to get more points towards the overall points goal. Now, what do these points mean, you may ask? And what I recommend doing is basically at the end of every phase to basically set aside a time to go have lunch, dinner, go do something fun together with your friends that are part of your league that isn't Warhammer related. And then basically the winner, everyone else splits the bill for the winner. It doesn't have to be anything fancy. You can go to Chick-fil-A and everyone chip in to buy the main guy's meal. Or if you want to be a bit more fancy, maybe go to a decent steakhouse in your area and, all the losers, second and below, end up paying for the first player. That way, it's not a super high financial commitment in addition to this already pretty financially viable hobby. And it'll give an incentive to each player to do their best and do the work. So that way they may be treated to a nice meal at the end, or, if you go to a fun park, amusement park, game place, stuff like that, just kind of gives everyone another avenue to hang out and enjoy each other's time. Because at the end of the day, you guys are hopefully still friends by the end of each phase, and you'll be able to enjoy each other's company in a way that isn't, just always doing Warhammer all the time, because that will lead to burnout, and we don't want that. The first section kind of talks about before the league. So basically, what each player should do kind of before the league starts to get an idea of what force they may be playing and that sort of thing. So first and foremost is to get the free core rules. So Warhammer Community actually has the downloads for the core rules. They can choose to get the core rule book. It's got more in-depth lore of each faction, some additional missions to be used for combat patrol sized missions, and a lot of other helpful information. But to play the base game, you can download the free core rules off Warhammer Community, or also they are within the Warhammer 40,000 app. The next thing I would recommend players doing is to watch gameplay videos of the army or armies that they are thinking about playing. This will kind of give them an idea of how this faction may play, give them a look at a bunch of the different units and how they play on the table. I also link to Tabletop Tactics and Play on Tabletop. Those are two of my favorite gameplay channels. They also have short form gameplay, which I think is really nice for those that are getting immediately into the hobby, because watching a 40-minute video is definitely better than watching a 3 or 4 hour video of a actual play of the game. The next thing they could do is to download an app like New Recruit to be able to look at some of the stats and stuff for their army before they invest in a codex. So if they watch the games and they think, okay, I'm still stuck between a couple of armies, they can get the New Recruit app, look at a few of the different data sheets and see what some of the units actually do to maybe push them in one direction or the other. And then that way they don't buy the codex to get the kind of official rules, stratagems, and everything. And they can have a rough idea of what these factions do to hopefully help them line up into one of the new factions they want to take part in. The Codex isn't necessarily required to play. I personally use the Warhammer 40,000 app, and I do pay for Warhammer Plus to be able to build as many lists as I want. For me, the user interface is much better than the Recruit app, but also with New Recruit, in order to gain access to your stratagems, you do have to pay for their subscription. So you don't need the subscription fee for Warhammer Plus to get your stratagems. The Warhammer Plus just allows you to build multiple lists. So if you're someone that you're thinking about multiple different lists and want to be able to easily switch between the two, that may be a worthy thing to look into, but is not required. You can always edit your roster, change your detachment, or if you run multiple armies, you can just re-input all of your stuff there. I personally have a 3,000 plus list on the app for each of my armies that is basically just my collection. So I just keep all my units and everything in there. So I have a running tally of my total number of points, but also so I can very easily and quickly just copy that list, remove the units that I don't want to use, and then that way all my lists are able to be very quickly created. Not required, but it does help. And having the Codex to get the app code will just help your players be able to quickly build lists in a way that maybe each of them will know how to use it. And because you're all learning on the same interface, there won't be any kind of weird pinch points when something doesn't look exactly the same on one interface as another. Next up, I talked through some ideas of how your players maybe should purchase their goods. Ideally, they would buy locally from the shop that you're planning to play at. But if you're not playing at a local shop, I still recommend buying from local just to help the community at large and be able to support those smaller shops that may not be able to get as much funding as GW makes directly, or box stores like Amazon would be able to make through your purchases. Now, if that's not feasible for you, you're in an area that doesn't really have a local store, then obviously you can purchase through Amazon, through Games Workshop and the like. Amazon will save you quite a bit of money. And there's also a few discount retailers online that you would be able to buy at a lower price as well. And if you're into a bit more of a project, you can also buy through eBay or Facebook Marketplace, purchasing someone's old collection to be able to make your own. Of course, you wouldn't get the league points for assembling, but if you did repaint it, then you would definitely get the points for that. Now let's talk about the individual phases that we'll be going through and my recommendations for each on how to proceed with games. So first up is 250 points. So this is 250 points, and it would include a character to be your warlord. Now, obviously, some of you or some of your players may be brand new to the hobby and have never played 40K before. So I also break down a few options for how to play a reduced version of 40K. It would still be viable for each of them to do. It'll get them through the phases of the game and then slowly incorporate more and more rules. So that way by the end of phase 1, they should be mostly comfortable playing a full game of 40K. But if not, if it bleeds into phase 2, it's not that big a deal, and they'll be well on their way to playing full games before phase 3. So for games at phase 1, you're only going to be using 250 points, which is a very, very small force. For some armies, that may be just your warlord, and for some it may just be your warlord and a single unit. Some other armies may be able to have multiple units, which is something to consider, but for the most part you're just kind of getting your bearings straight. And for many of you that may be doing this league with a new army that you have not collected before, you may be able to skip some of these initial games and be able to just take on full games, or just prioritize hobbying and then really start gaming in phase 2 at the 500 points, where it'll be a little bit more of an equal force, where you'll be playing roughly combat patrol sized forces. So for new players, I kind of recommend a breakdown of games such as this. At the very beginning, a very basic game is just going to be your units and nothing else. And there won't be any scoring involved here. It's just getting them to understand how to reference their data sheets, how to use the different stats on there in the game, and that sort of deal. In this phase as well, I also have it set so that each player receives 20 victory points. And then this way, they'll still have a viable number of victory points to be able to utilize at the end when tallying the final results. In case they don't get any other games in, that will still put them in the running, at least potentially for one of the placements. For the second game, you want to add in the army rule, the detachment rule, and a primary mission. You can do just a basic one from the mission deck at the time. I would recommend just take and hold, something very simple where it's just standing on circles. I know it's not the most fun, but at least this way they'll get to know what, OC is, what objective control is, and some of their detachment rules may interact with objective markers, and it will be a good way for them to kind of understand how the overarching rule of their army and detachments impacts the game as a whole. We're not going to mess with unit abilities just yet, just because that becomes very meticulous. And at this phase, we're still getting them used to, rolling their damage, rolling their wounds, and getting used to the kind of the small gears and getting those motors running very first. And of course, the winner in this case will be determined by those primary victory scores. So keep that in mind as they proceed forward. Similar to the second one, the third game, all we're going to be adding on here is the unit rules. This will also include keywords such as scouts and deep strike. This way, they already know how to basically use their units, but we can introduce a little bit more complex themes such as scouting forward, infiltrating, deep striking, and other things to help them understand how the game can have some additional nuance. And while they're still scoring only primary victory points, they're not going to have the added weight of secondary missions affecting them interacting with this, and it'll make it a lot more easy for them to reference their data sheets, realize what their units individually can do, and how they interact with their army and detachment rules in a quicker way. And then in the fourth game, you're basically just going to add in everything else. So secondary rules and stratagems will come into play here. So you'll be playing full games of 40K starting at their fourth game. I've personally learned in a similar way, and I've also helped teach people in a similar way. And I found that this actually does help a lot with just taking on the number of layers that are in 40K. And it just kind of helps. By the end of this, they're able to play full games and be able to understand where their shortcomings may be, and they can kind of focus on that in their future games. But this way, they've kind of taken each step of the game step by step, and now that they've been able to play a full game, they'll have the confidence going into the next tier, the next phase, with more models and be able to accomplish games in a more satisfying way. An important note to those of you that may be the league organizer. I do reference the league organizer a lot in this document, as there will likely be at least one of you that is effectively running the whole thing and keeping tabs on your players, making sure everyone's having a good time, and that sort of thing. The league organizer will need to be comfortable playing multiples of these games with their newer players, especially if it is a case where you are the only veteran player and all of your other players are new to the hobby. You will kind of bear the burden of being the teacher, and you need to understand that that can come with a lot of needed patience. If you are playing with other veteran players, I would recommend asking them how they feel about teaching players through this way, and make sure that they feel confident and comfortable in doing so. And more than likely they are your friend. You may know that they may or may not have the patience of a teacher, and it may be best to let them know that, hey, for this section, maybe have some of the other players handle teaching just because X reason. Maybe they just have a tendency to be a bit more hyper competitive or be more quick players or the like. And you just want to make sure that your newer players are having a good time, but obviously those veteran players will also want to have a good time as well. So be ready to be available for each of those people and be able to play either those very new beginner games or to be able to play a little bit more competitively with your more veteran players. So that wraps up the 250 phase, which is phase 1. So moving into phase 2, we're looking at 500 points. Now, obviously, the idea and the hope is that everyone that is new would have been able to play those 4 beginner games. At that size, it will be rather quick. So I do think that it's definitely doable. You can probably knock out 1 or 2 of those games in each session. So, take a couple, if you're doing 2 months, maybe the first month is just building / painting, and then the second month is primarily gaming, and then you're able to meet up, play a couple of the quick games, and then meet up again, play the other 2. And then that way, moving into phase 2, all your players are on the same page and you're all playing full games of Warhammer. Another thing to keep in mind is that at this stage, there may be a player or 2 that wants to start over. Maybe they aren't liking their army and they want to try something new. I think at this phase, what may be a good idea is to try and maybe push them to, just consider some different units for their army, or allow them to play another person's force. Obviously, some people may not be okay with this, so keep that in mind as well. But I would be okay with allowing someone in my league to be able to play with one of my armies, just so they can give a taste for it, if they want to consider changing things up. At this stage, it is important that you maybe allow them to start over if they would like to, keeping in mind that at this stage, they will likely have to get just a combat patrol box and maybe a couple extra units to be able to fill out what they need. And that's going to require them to be a little bit on the back pedal, and they will need to be able to quickly build their forces in order to catch up with the rest of them, because we want to encourage people into this hobby. We also need to make sure that we are keeping a healthy pace for the other players that have found an army that they really enjoy, and we don't want to keep them tied back for too long. But in phase 2, you will be playing games between 250 and 500 points, and obviously the newer players are going to be playing full games, and you may have a couple cases where they may be on games 3 and 4 of the beginner games where they haven't fully graduated to a full game of 40K, and that is a-okay. At these lower sizes as well, we're going to be playing on half boards, just to make things a lot easier and be able to get up close and personal faster, to also help make these games a bit quicker. Phase 3 is 750 points. So you'll be playing games at 500 to 750 points. At this stage, I recommend players consider adding in monsters and vehicles if they haven't already. Obviously, if they're playing an army that really leans on these things, such as Tyranid's Crusher Stampede, or one of the vehicle-heavy detachments in Space Marines, or obviously something like Chaos or Imperial Knights. As we may know as more veteran players, usually you're going to have 1 or 2 monsters or vehicles per 1,000 points of any typical list, as long as you're not in those skew categories of either Monster Mash or Horde. Most typical lists will kind of have a nice balance there. And they'll want to be sure to have some of those heavier hitters, because as we get into these higher points values, they're going to want something that can take on the bigger items that your opponents are going to be bringing. So really, that's about the only additional bit of wisdom I have in phase 3, because at 750 points, we're getting so close to 1,000 points that they should already kind of be pushing themselves in a certain direction of their army, and having an idea of where their 1,000 point list is going to be, and potentially even their eventual 2,000 point list, if they are deciding to go that far. At 750 points, it is going to be very difficult for a player to start over at this phase, keeping in mind that will effectively mean that they're going to be building and painting a roughly 1,000 point list, because by the time we get to 750, everyone else will have already had 500 points under their belt, and they're going to have to build that and use this 2-month span, if you're going that 2-month route, to catch up with everyone else. So in 2 months, building 1,000 points is a ton of work, and I do not recommend it at all. So we want to make sure that in the first 2 phases, that 250, 500 point, that we are making sure that all our players are comfortable with their list, and that if they're not having a good time, that we just cater to them, let them play the smaller games with us, play our armies and that sort of thing if they're just not feeling it. And of course, if they're just not feeling it, maybe it's not the hobby for them, and that's okay. I would much rather them learn that at the 250 and 500 point scale, instead of getting up to 1,000 or more before realizing that they really don't like the hobby and that they were really just kind of playing to hang out with us. Because obviously, while I would love for all my friends to play 40K and I'd be able to play with them all the time, it's not reality, right? You're going to have friends that are more into other things, and you want to make time for them in those hobbies as well, and that sort of thing. Maybe you can still invite them to the kind of phase end lunch or game day, whatever you guys end up doing, just to keep them involved with that community. And maybe it'll end up bringing them back in at a later phase, which could be a lot of fun. And maybe you guys end up doing a second league where you build up from bottom again with maybe a new army, or maybe just focusing heavily on a new detachment. You're moving into the phase 4, which is 1,000 points. Obviously at 1,000 points, you guys are in the reins of a official Warhammer 40,000 army. In phase 4, however, you're going to be playing 750 to 1,000 points, because obviously this phase is building you towards your 1,000 point forces. In this phase as well, if your players are wanting to get an idea of what a full-scale game would be like, then you can have multiple kind of free-for-alls or 2v2s, basically having each side add up to that 2,000 point threshold. That'll give you an idea of how long a 2,000 point game is going to be. Of course, you guys are learning still. There is going to be a little bit of hiccuping, and when you have multiple players, obviously there is a little bit of back and forth and that sort of thing that will cause some gum ups, but for the most part, it's going to give you a better idea of what that size is going to feel like and be well on your way to the full game of Warhammer 40,000. And then lastly, I have phase 5, which is onwards and upwards. So it's phase 5 plus, because basically at this stage, there's a lot of different directions that you can go. At this stage, everyone should have a force of 1,000 points at least. Obviously, there could be more, there could be a little bit less. You are likely going to run into a few data set updates that could affect points totals for better or for worse. So keeping that in mind, that's where everyone is going to be. So everyone should be within range of each other and around that 1,000 points value. So what do we do at this phase? Obviously, you can stop here. Everyone's got 1,000 points or there and of, and you can either choose to keep collecting or stop collecting, and you can still play games with one another, building up your league points towards that coveted free dinner at the end of the phase. But also you may want a slightly different experience, and I do talk about that in this phase. So within phase 5, because you may have players of different levels having different army sizes, this is where you could have fun with multiplayer battles. So if you have one player that's decided that they are gung-ho and they're going to keep collecting, and they get to a point where they're in that like 1,500 kind of phase, you could have 2 players play 750 against them and have a 2v1. 2v1s are actually a ton of fun. It gets players really excited, and it kind of gives the one player that feeling of being sort of the arch enemy, which is always a lot of fun, especially if you play games like Magic the Gathering, where you kind of have to fend for yourself against multiple equal opponents. It can be a lot of fun, and I actually played this a lot as I was building my forces. We had a few newer players, one of which really focused on one army, and they had a force of about 2,000 points. So a few of us that were at smaller points values would team up at 1,000 points and face them, and it was a great time. And I think that it's a great way to kind of get a different feel for the game, be able to play some tag team, and introduce some interesting strategies between factions that definitely wouldn't have participated together in the past. And it can be an interesting narrative to kind of piece out and put together and figure out why these two factions have decided to ally themselves against what appears to be a greater threat. And speaking of narrative ideas, one thing that you guys may think about is if they want more of a role-playing experience, you could look at investing in Crusade. Crusade is definitely a very fun way to play. A lot of people tend to tack it on as 40k with homework, which in some reality it kind of is, because you will be needing to tally up experience points, leveling up your characters and units in between each game, and figuring out kind of which narrative you're going to be playing. But it is a great way to get players invested, and you can choose to have a further growing campaign across your new phases as you push into this. Maybe continuing that 2-month cycle, increasing your Crusade lists by 250 points every time, and then after another 4 or 5 phases, you guys will have well into 2,000 points. You'll have very intense Crusade armies and a wonderful story will have unfolded before you with the various different narrative rules of Crusade. It can be a very fun and flavorful way to continue playing Warhammer 40,000, but it's definitely not for everybody. So I also talk about the idea of implementing a tournament structure into your future phases. With more of a tournament structure, what you're going to want to do is to pair your players up. Ideally, I would recommend random. I know that sounds not necessarily like the best, but if you start pairing them up based on their league points or based on their, total cumulative victory points, you're going to have a weird struggle, right? You're going to have your two best players play first, and unless you pair them in a specific way or run what I recommend Swiss, you may end up eliminating your second best player or your best player in the first round, and you don't want that. So I recommend using Swiss round, which basically means that players are going to play each other based on their total rankings. So in your first overall bracket, you're going to want to pair your players, and like I said, I recommend random, just so that way it doesn't feel like you're pairing the two best players or the two worst players. It's just everyone has equal opportunity to do their best, and then you pair based on their rankings. So winning will net them 3 points, losing will net them 1 point. If there happens to be a draw, both players will get 2 points. And what you'll basically do is after the first round, your 1-0s will play each other, your 0-1s will play each other, and then in the next round you'll have 2-0s, 0-2s, and 1-1s. So you'll basically pair those guys up, matching their different rankings, and then at the very end you'll end up with your victor. So the winner of the 2-0s will be your victor, and then to figure out the rest of them, the 3-0s opponent will be the next best because they have the highest ranking based on their opponent standings. Then anyone that ties for third, all you need to do is sum up the total of their opponent's total rankings, and then one of them will have played a better string of opponents, and therefore they would have had a harder time getting to where they are, and that would mean that they score third. And you can do that for the rest of your roster, and that'll give you a full standing list of how everyone pairs up. And this could be a very interesting way to kind of learn where you stand among your players and your opponents. And I just recommend doing 3 rounds. I think that's plenty. But if you end up having many more, so 8 players is a lot. I don't think I would be able to get 8 players within a league with my current friend group. I would likely be looking at 4, maybe even 5. But 3 rounds here is ideal. You'll be able to definitely get that within 2 months. Get everybody playing in that round. You may even be able to get 2 tournament rounds in before the end of the phase, which would be great, and it would just give everyone even better understanding of where they stand among their peers. But that would be what I would recommend for if you want to lean more towards the tournament layout. And there's a lot of other interesting ways to run tournaments within your friend group and that sort of thing. One thing that I found kind of interesting is doing sort of a match play league. If I referenced, Play on Tabletop before, and one thing that they do is eventually they actually have to rotate through their detachments in order to basically continue playing. So if you win, you have to keep your list the same, but once you lose, you have to change your detachment at least. And you can change any of your units after you lost. And then that way, the winners have to stick with their list, but the losers are able to kind of pick and choose units to maybe be able to topple that victor in future rounds or future tournaments, since we're doing such a quick turnaround and not such a not a full round robin, which would be everyone playing everyone. Which if you're in a very small group, such as 3 or 4, maybe a round robin tournament where everyone plays everyone each round, and then you do basically the matched pairings like we were doing before, where we tally up the total scores based on wins, losses, and draws to basically push them into who ranks supreme. That is how I would recommend running a league. Like I said before, you can actually see the document down in the description down below, so feel free to take that, run with it however you see fit, and maybe bring that to your group. And maybe if you're a new player that wants to get into the hobby, and you know some friends that are into it, maybe bring this to them and see if it's something that they may be willing to kind of work with alongside you. And maybe they may not be building this force up, but you will be, and basically they'll be able to benchmark and kind of walk you through each of these hurdles as you build your force. So thank you guys so much for watching. I had a great time kind of putting this all together, and I'd love to hear your feedback in the comments down below. And after you take a look at the document, if there's anything you think should be added, I would love to incorporate it going forward to provide you all with more details and more abilities to kind of grow a league in your community going forward. But thank you guys so much for your support, and I'll see you guys in the next one.